Marty McFly. He's without a doubt one of the coolest and most iconic movie characters of all time. He's also many things. He's a teenager. He's street smart. He's a musician. He's courageous. He's brave. He cares about his future. And he's also a video pirate. What? A video pirate? What are you talking about? The Marty McFly I remember wasn't a video pirate. My God, what tomfoolery is this? Well, yeah, in the original Back to the Future script, both Doc and Marty dabble in video piracy and have a sort of underground operation going on. In fact, there are a lot of insane differences between some of the early Back to the Future scripts and the 1985 classic movie that we all know and love. And it really is quite interesting seeing how one of the most celebrated movies of all time could have been so different. And if the movie did turn out like this, would it still be the Back to the Future that we all know and love? The original script is like the timeline skewered into a tangent, creating an alternate Back to the Future. One that is really quite different.
Whoa, this is heavy.
So today we are going to do another episode of Script versus Movie, where I look at a movie and compare it to its original script. Yes, I know I haven't done one of these in a while, but hey, we're going to do another one now, and what better movie to look at than Back to the Future? Some of the differences will intrigue you, some will make you think, yeah Minty, we already know that, we've already seen the movies that made us, but some will shock you, in a good way, so let's check it out.
I'm from the future. I came here in a time machine that you invented.
Do you know what this means? It means that this damn thing doesn't work at all.
Well, let's start off by looking at the movie's settings. In the movie, we learn that Marty's hometown is called Hill Valley, and Marty lives in the year 1985. And over the course of events, he gets stuck in the year 1955. Well, the original Back to the Future script that was written by the movie's producer and director Bob Gale and Robert Zemeckis was written in 1980, with the movie set to be taking place in 1982, with Marty travelling to 1952. Because of this, the script doesn't feel very 80s. When the script was written, the 80s had barely started, and no one could have predicted what the 80s would be like, whereas thanks to the delays in the movie's production, the movie's date was changed to 1985, which was the heart of the 80s. I mean, after all, this was the year of Live Aid, and it doesn't get any more 80s than that. So by the time Gale and Zemeckis could rework on the script, the 80s already had an identity for them to work with. An identity of Pepsi Free, Tab, and Huey Lewis and the News. To me, this was also a benefit for the 1950s aspect, as the original script was set in 1952, but the birth of the teenager and thus rock and roll music and other 1950s tropes started in the mid-50s, so the full vibe of the 50s could be felt by setting the movie in 1955, of which probably couldn't have been done if it was set in 1952. Also in the original script, Hill Valley wasn't Hill Valley yet, but simply known as small Midwestern town. And it's here we get to the characters. And Doc probably changed the most. Originally he was Professor, with Marty referring to him as Prof. Prof doesn't live in a garage like we see in the film, but an abandoned theatre. And he doesn't have a pet dog called Einstein, but rather a pet chimp called SHEMP. But Universal Pictures told Bob Gale that movies starring chimpanzees don't make money, so SHEMP was written out. It's unclear why a pet chimp was originally in the story. But the Back to the Future episode of the Movies That Made Us explains that Gale and Zemeckis were fans of Clint Eastwood movies. And so they probably got the idea from watching the 1978 Clint Eastwood movie, Any Which Way But Loose. Which actually would have been a fairly new movie at the time the original script was written. It's here we get to Marty, and what I find to be the most interesting difference between script and movie, and that is that he is a street video pirate who runs a black market video piracy operation with Doc, aka Prof. Just imagine what that would have been like had that stayed in. This probably would have made Marty seem more like an outlaw and more rebellious and maybe even a bad boy, as opposed to the likeable everyday guy that Michael J. Fox portrays. And it also kind of makes Doc look bad, as he's essentially leading a 17-year-old boy down a life of crime. Yes, I know the morality of Doc is already questionable, what with doing business with terrorists and thus putting Marty's life in danger and causing him to get stuck in time, but it just would have seemed wrong for Doc to deliberately be encouraging Marty to take on a life of crime in the street world underbelly of video piracy. The video piracy scheme that Doc and Marty were involved in was to make money so Doc can pay for his experiments. So not only is Doc making Marty break the law for his own gain, but also slave labor too. Nice! Another reason why this is so wrong is despite his misgivings, Doc is meant to be a mentor to Marty and sort of like a voice of reason. So it would have been like, "Now Marty, your future is what you make of it! Make it a good one! By the way, did you remember to make pirate copies of Ghostbusters to illegally sell on the streets to pay for my illegal experiments?" Yeah, awkward. I wonder what the Australian authorities would think of Marty's video piracy caper.
Video piracy is a major problem in Australia.
Yeah, you see that? They won't like it.
Pirate tapes rob artists and studios of their rightful income.
Yes, okay, thank you.
And add to the cost of a video to the consumer.
Okay, we get it.
Please help us stop it.
Alright already, sheesh! Even actor John Cryer said that when he auditioned for Marty when the movie was in its early stage of production, the movie started off with Marty playing the Close Encounters theme on his guitar while making copies of pirate videotapes. Naturally, the video piracy element was removed from the script as Universal didn't want to have themes that encouraged video piracy in a movie that they were producing, which is fair enough when you think about it. Okay, look, I don't want to make it sound like I'm a video piracy narc, and I'm like, all this video piracy, won't someone think of the children? No, that's not what it's like. But more, Doc is getting Marty to directly do something that can actually get him into a lot of trouble. Remember in the 80s, there were pretty steep penalties for video piracy. Cryer also said that in the original script, the time machine was powered by Coca-Cola. Okay, that just gives me Mac and Me vibes. So it's here we get to the time machine. As we all know in the original script, the time machine wasn't a DeLorean. After all, the DeLorean that we see in the film wasn't even made by the time the first script was written. Instead, Doc, or rather Prof's time-traveling invention was a refrigerator. But it was decided that that was too dangerous as children may try to climb into their refrigerators at home after watching the movie. So let me get this right, just to make sure I haven't skipped a beat or anything. But it was a time-traveling refrigerator that's powered by Coca-Cola. Hey Elon, it's me again, and I've got a brilliant idea for a new invention. Now let's look at some other significant differences. One of the original scripts start off with Marty in class, namely social studies, and his social studies teacher was called Mr. Archie, who's described as wearing glasses. And I wonder if he was meant to be the teacher that Huey Lewis plays. The class is studying atomic power and watching an old 1950s documentary about the issue. And Mr. Archie catches Marty listening to his Walkman in class and singing along with it, where Mr. Archie has a sort of stare-off with Marty, but Marty stares him down right back and Mr. Archie backs off. Because in this version, Marty is a badass. Marty's high school girlfriend isn't Jennifer Parker, but is called Susie Parker. And later on when Marty discovers the time machine, he is instantly intrigued by using it for financial gain, which is a theme that will be explored more in Back to the Future Part 2. Doc doesn't get shot by terrorists, but in the original script it was government agents who were working for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And Doc's demise wasn't captured on a home camcorder, but a tape recorder. So Marty finds himself in 1952, but he doesn't use the alias Calvin Klein, but Marty Lewis, where he bumps into his parents who are also teenagers. And originally Marty's mum wasn't called Lorraine, but EILEEN. When Marty meets up with the prof, he tells Marty that he got the vision of the flux capacitor after a girl hit him on the head with a bottle at a party, unlike the film where it was falling down while hanging a clock. I read somewhere that at one stage in one of the early scripts that while Marty was stuck in the 50s, he didn't stay at Doc's mansion, but the Baines household. Marty has to set up his parents at the high school dance, which originally wasn't called the Enchantment Under the Sea dance, but rather Springtime in Paris. And Marty doesn't just perform Johnny Be Good, but also Rock Around the Clock. Upon returning to 1982 from 1952, things had changed as we had seen in the film, but this time George McFly had grown up to be a boxer. I guess he really got carried away after knocking out Biff. Also, the 1982 that Marty returns to is a futuristic world with flying cars, like what we see in part 2. But on a really bleak note, after performing at the Enchantment Under the Sea dance, or in this case, Springtime in Paris, Marty actually deleted Rock and Roll from Time, because the audience and band that he played with disliked it so much, causing it to never happen. So the new world of 1982 is mainly listening to mumbo music. Hey, I like mumbo music, but seriously? There was no rock? Yeah, thanks a lot, Marty. It's here we get to the most notorious change, the one that everyone knows about and no doubt thinks was probably changed for the best. And that's how Marty gets home. In the early scripts, they couldn't have Marty drive the car while generating energy from a lightning bolt that hits the clock tower, as at that stage the time machine wasn't a car but a refrigerator. So there was a plot where Doc and Marty travel to a nuclear testing site in the middle of the desert, where Doc concludes that the energy from the nuclear blast will be enough to power up the time machine and send Marty back to 1982, which is what happens in the script. And yes, although this scene didn't make it into Back to the Future, the notion of this scene was recycled for Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and thus the term nuking the fridge was invented.
Buttheads.
I think the changes that were made were for the best. All the elements that were changed just seemed to be put into place perfectly, thus creating a better storytelling atmosphere. I don't know what the movie would have been like if it featured a chimp, or a coke-powered time machine, or nuclear explosions and video piracy. But above all, I feel like in the film they made, the characters Doc and Marty are more likeable, as opposed to being immoral and slightly corrupt. Marty in particular I felt was more rebellious in the original script, and a tad bit unlikable and maybe even a little bit smug. A far cry from Michael J. Fox's lovable charm. After all, it's the likeable characters which make the Heartbeat and Back to the Future shine so much. So in this case, I say thank heavens these changes were made, as the Back to the Future we did end up getting is an absolute masterpiece. There are tons of differences in the script, of which I haven't gone through them all, so if this topic fascinates you, then definitely check out the original Back to the Future script. If anything, it's an eye-opener as to what could have been. For a film series which itself is all about alternative timelines and possibilities. So this script is like an alternative Back to the Future, where Marty didn't get the almanac back after all. Anyway, I'm Inty, and I'm off to buy some coke to power up the 1.21 gigawatts. Yes, that sounds weird, but that could have been. See ya!